Hello everyone and welcome to SkillCapped. I'm Notorious Dub and today you guys are going to be learning the best mouse sensitivities to get you guys well on your way to fragging out and getting the most kills as possible in Valorant. Now your sensitivity can really set you back or propel you forward if you have the perfect one for you, which is why in this updated guide we're going to be covering everything you need to know about the current state of the sensitivity meta in Valorant, because it's changed a ton since the beta and in the past few months as well with all of the new pros entering the scene. And because of that I'm going to be covering everything from the basics of DPI and eDPI all the way to the ranges of sensitivities that the pros use so you can tailor your game to what we know works. And towards the end of the video I'm going to throw in a ton of extra tips to make sure your sensitivity is perfect for you. But as always, before we get too deep into the video, we have to start with our question of the day. And today I wanted to ask you guys who your favorite Valorant player is right now and why. Personally, I've always been a huge fan of aceu because his reaction time and target switching is absolutely insane, which leads to crazy multi-kills and flicks that no one else is really hitting. But if we're talking about a pure Valorant player, I have to give it to my man Tenz. And I know that's a popular one, but his reaction time is insane. His game sense is always at the top of its level, to the point where it seems like he has wall hacks, and he just has an extremely explosive playstyle where he finds or creates holes in the enemy setup and pressures until the round collapses, making it extremely exciting to watch. But I'm sure you guys have a ton of different opinions than me on this, which is exactly why I want to hear from you. So let me know in the comments down below who your favorite Valorant player is right now and why. Now to start with, let's talk about DPI, because it's the baseline of your sensitivity that controls how you navigate your computer in general, and is going to affect your in-game sensitivity as well. So DPI stands for dots per inch, which basically just means how far you move your mouse on the screen in pixels per inch that you move your mouse on the desk. So naturally you would probably think you would have slightly more control over a high DPI mouse setting because there are more pixels that you're splitting up and working with, right? And technically for making very detailed edits in a design program, a higher DPI would be beneficial if you could get used to it, because you can make those very minor adjustments if you tailor your window sensitivity to it, which we'll talk about later in the video. Higher DPIs are also great for high resolution displays, where a low DPI would take a while to get to the outer edges of the screen, but for first person shooter purposes, which is what we care about, a quote-unquote low DPI has been preferred since the beginning of time. So for pros in Valorant, the most used DPI right now is 400, and coming in at a whopping 53%. And then the second most is 800 DPI at 37%, and every other DPI falls into the other category at 10%. And this is because a DPI higher than 800 may result in an almost unnoticeable, more fluid movement, but you don't necessarily want super fluid movement. Instead, you want your aim to be snappy, and when you're at 400 DPI, it's noticeably much easier to stay at that exact headshot level, which is rarely changing, than if you use a higher DPI, because it feels like your crosshair slightly gets locked in that plane of motion. But realistically, for 400 and 800 DPI, it's pretty much a toss-up, and it comes down to personal preference. But when it comes to DPI higher than 800, you've probably heard companies advertise extremely high DPI choices for their mice, like 10,000 DPI, just to sell these gaming mice. But the baseline for max DPI is 1600 for stock mice, which means whenever you get over that threshold, it's just the company splitting pixels in the center to make it seem like it's better, but overall it results in more inconsistent movements because it's just sending more noise throughout the mouse for it to have to process. So definitely stick with that 400 or 800 DPI, and if you feel the need to go to a 1600, then feel free, but realize DPI is only half of the equation. Valorant actually has a built-in sensitivity that needs to be calculated as well, which is what we're going to call eDPI. But remember, if you're serious about improving, then go to SkillCapped.com to unlock our hyper improvement system that will teach you how to win more gunfights, master your agent, and so much more. It's also backed by our rank improvement guarantee, so you really have nothing to lose. So come join over 500,000 satisfied members of SkillCapped, improve that KDA, and get the rank you've always wanted at SkillCapped.com. Link is in the description below. Now, eDPI stands for effective dots per inch, and that basically means how far your cursor moves in game relative to how far you move your mouse on the desk. And we get this number by multiplying your in-game sensitivity by your DPI. So let's take a look at hiko's eDPI. Now to start with, we see hiko is one of about 10 Valorant pros that actually use 1600 DPI, and his in-game sensitivity is 0.360, and by simply multiplying those two numbers together, you come up with 576, which is hiko's eDPI, which just means we now have a baseline number to compare ourselves to pros and pros to other pros to see how our sensitivities all stack up relative to one another, and we can now tailor our sensitivities to what the pros are using. So do this yourself really quickly and see how you stack up with hiko. Take your current DPI in your mouse's settings and multiply that with your in-game sensitivity, and there you have your eDPI. So are you higher or lower than hiko? If you're higher than hiko's eDPI, keep in mind that hiko has the 5th highest eDPI of all 215 current Valorant pros. Not that you can't make it work, but let's be honest, hiko's built a little different than most people. So if he's almost at the top of the sensitivity list, you probably don't want to put yourself in that polarizing spot. But you can always play it safe by making making sure you're in that most common range that most of the pros are going to operate in. Because across a ton of different games, we see a standardized eDPI range that the vast majority of pros are in depending on the game. And now that the Valorant eDPI meta is being set in stone very well, let's take a look at the eDPI range that you should probably be operating in, because the best performers are always in that range. Now, a ton of people talk about high sensitivity and low sensitivity gamers, but if you're coming from different games, high sense and low sense mean way different things to you. For instance, if you're coming from League of Legends, the meta in that game is insanely high sensitivities in game, and even an extremely low eDPI for League of Legends would be way too high for Valorant. But in CSGO, the eDPI meta is much lower, and even a high sense player in CSGO would probably still be around the middle of the pack for Valorant. So what is considered high sense and low sense in Valorant? So out of 215 current Valorant pros, 14 pros are above 400 eDPI, meaning somewhere around the 400 eDPI range would be high sense, and the top end of the accepted range would be somewhere around 600 eDPI, just above what hiko has. So if your eDPI is above that 400, and especially if you're above the 600 range, I would highly consider lowering your DPI or sensitivity to bring you back closer to the range that we know works, below that 400 eDPI. And for low sensitivity, there are only 3 current Valorant pros that are below the 150 eDPI threshold, which would put anything from the 200 to 150 eDPI range would be a low sense player. We also have a huge amount of players that play in the 200 to 250 eDPI range, and that's the most populated range for pro players, meaning that's going to be a very consistent middle ground for you to start at to keep you able to hit very consistent headshots with the low sensibility, but still be able to whip your mouse around, have fluid movement, and swap between angles easily like a high sense player would. So the basic ranges to keep in mind is 150 eDPI to 400 is essentially the accepted range for pro players, and the vast majority of people are going to be within that 200 to 250 eDPI range, just to give you a starting point. But if you wanted to find an eDPI that should work for most people, the average eDPI for Valorant pros is 278, which puts you at about 47 centimeters to do a full 360, or about 18 inches, which doesn't mean you have to copy it. Everyone is different, but it can give you a great starting point. But how do you find the sensitivity that's right for you? Now, finding your sensitivity, or at least your starting point, is actually very simple, but you're going to be tailoring your sensitivity to yourself over time. But don't worry, adapting to a new sensitivity should get you almost back to normal after about 20 minutes of consistent practice, and over time it's going to end up being a huge improvement. So first of all, find out what your pivot point is. For me, my pivot point is the very back of my forearm, and I have a very big mouse pad, which means I can have a very low sensitivity and it's very comfortable for me. But if your pivot point is your wrist, that's where you move your mouse at, a high sensitivity is going to be much more accessible, because you can swap around those angles all by only having to move your wrist and not having to bring too much arm into it. But don't just assume your current pivot point is your only option because you're used to it. Try out using your forearm or your elbow or your wrist as a pivot point as well, just to see if it feels all right to you. But now that you have that set in stone, you now know what your sensitivity is going to look like. The closer to your hand your pivot point is, the higher the end of the sensitivity spectrum you're going to want to be at. If your wrist is your pivot point, then you're going to want to play around a 400 eDPI as a starting point. So just take your DPI divided by 400, and that's going to be the number for your in-game sensitivity. And if your elbow is your pivot point and you have a big enough mouse pad, then you're going to be on the lower end, around the 200 eDPI threshold starting out. So just take your DPI divided by 200, and that's going to be your in-game sensitivity. Simple enough, right? From there, you want to start tailoring it to yourself though. Move around the map and see if you're picking up your mouse way more than you want to, or if your sensitivity is too high where you can't actually micro adjust properly to heads, and you can tailor it from there. But if you're limited by your mouse pad, or you don't really know where to start, do this. Take your mouse and place it on the left edge of your mouse pad, or just measure out about 18 inches on your mouse pad. From there, go in game and aim at the corner of a wall, and move your mouse from the left side all the way to the right side, and that should at least be over a 180-degree turn, and for most people you're going to want that to be closer to a 360. That way you can utilize your entire mouse pad, and you have a good sense to start with that you don't have to pick up your mouse a ton with, and you have a starting point to start tailoring your sensitivity to your own needs. But there is another hidden calculation in the sensitivity math that you've probably not heard of, or at least looked at for a very long time, and that's a window sensitivity setting. Here there's not going to be any math or anything complicated, but type in mouse settings in your search bar of your computer, and that will pull up the mouse settings box. From there, click on the additional mouse options off to the side, and it will bring up your mouse properties. From there, go to pointer options, and you will be able to change your sensitivity in the Windows options, and there is a sliding wheel with 11 tick marks on it. The standard in which you should have your mouse set to would be the 6th tick mark, because that's a baseline baseline that most people are going to be using. But I have had a ton of people come to me and tell me it's been off when I tell them about it, and even myself, I played with the mouse acceleration on for about 6 months. So it's one of those mistakes that happen, but you don't always know about it. And the mouse acceleration option is going to be right below the pointer speed, where it says enhance pointer precision. Make sure you uncheck that box because you want the raw information from your mouse being sent to the game and not whatever calculations Windows is trying to do to change that information. And with both of these settings set properly, you can be sure you've got the standard settings that are going to be consistent for you and you really never have to touch them again. But now with the Windows settings out of the way, we do have to talk about your aiming down sight sensitivity, because if you're using a Vandal and tap firing from range or using the Spectre at any time, the aiming down sights mechanic is going to be a huge favor for you. So what should your sensitivity be, and what are the pros doing? Well, right now the average scope sensitivity setting for Valorant is 0.97, but that doesn't mean it's the most common sensitivity. In fact, I couldn't actually find anyone who used that sensitivity. Instead, we have an overwhelming 81% of pros in Valorant using a 1 scoped sensitivity multiplier to keep their aim consistent no matter whether you're aiming down sights or not. But you have to keep in mind, when you aim down sights, your field of view effectively changes a little bit, which would make your crosshair seem slightly faster. And to offset this, we do have a lot of pros that use a 0.9 aiming down sight sensitivity just to get it a little bit closer to what it would be if you didn't aim down sights. And that's where the 0.97 comes from. The average of people around the 0.9 mark, and that vast majority of people, they use 1. But I do see a ton of other people using other sensitivities, especially if they came from other games like Fortnite, but you're overcomplicating it. Your ADS sensitivity should be around that 1 mark, and you should leave it at that. But finally, let's talk about the other stats that are relevant. So one huge thing that's important for consistency in aiming is your mouse's polling rate. And for this, you're going to want to crank up your polling rate as high as it can go for your mouse. And with this, we have an overwhelming 93% of Valorant pros using a 1000 Hz polling rate, and the other 7% are at 500, probably because their mouse doesn't go up to 1000. So go in your mouse's software and crank up that polling rate as high as you can. But with sensitivity and consistently, you also need a good mouse pad to be able to operate effectively, right? And the number one thing that you should make sure you're picking out is a big enough mouse pad, at least 18 inches in width, but the bigger the better. And the most used brand for Valorant pros are going to be the Zowie mouse pads, with the GSR and the GSR SE having an even split down the middle of how many people use either or. But realistically, a somewhat dense cloth mouse pad that's big enough is going to work wonders for you. And of course, we have to talk about the mice that the pros are using. And for this, keep in mind a ton of pros are sponsored by Logitech, so the numbers are a bit skewed. But the Logitech G Pro Wireless is by far the most common mouse used in the Valorant scene because it has an insane response time with a great sensor to the point where it's just better than its wired counterparts. And then the Zowie EC2 is the most common wired mouse that looks very basic, but it is very consistent, very well performing, and a staple mouse in the FPS scene, and probably will be for a while now. But remember, if you want to improve, win more gunfights, and get the rank you have always wanted, then check out SkillCapped.com. Link is in the description below. And how did your sensitivity stack up to the Valorant pros? And did you change anything up after watching this video? Let me know in the comments down below. And while you're down there, make sure to hit that subscribe button and turn those notification bells on, because we here at SkillCapped have a ton more comprehensive premium guides coming your way that you're going to want to stay up to date with so you can stay ahead of the pack. As always, I want to thank you for spending this little bit of your day with us, and I'm Notorious Dub, signing off.